Good morning, everyone. The clock tells me it is 9 a.m. here in Toronto, so we should get started. And I'm sure there's a lot of people trickling in. We see the waiting rooms are full, so we will soon have people joining in. So good morning to everyone in North America. Good afternoon to those of you in Europe and in Africa. And a good evening, and in particular to some of our colleagues, a good late evening in Asia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dilip Soman. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, and I head up a research center called BEAR, Behavioral Economics in Action. BEAR is also home to a large international partnership of academics and organizations called the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnerships. And in fact, this conference, the symposium, comes out of collaborative work in that partnership. Now, before we start, I know we are meeting online, but I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates, and I would similarly encourage all of you to pay respects to the original residents of your respective lands. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many, many Indigenous peoples from all across Turtle Islands, and we are absolutely grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, this symposium has its roots a few months ago when we had a conversation with folks at BEAR, Ideas 42, Shogato Datta was there, Josh Martin, who was then at Ideas 42, World Bank, Abby Dalton, and Renos Wakis, and the Foundation of Social Change, Claire Williams, as well as Jiaying Zhao, who's at UBC. And while we were noting that there are a number of interesting projects being done in the area of cash transfer programs, social assistance more generally, we also recognized that there was no central resource. There was no central community to share findings, to serve as a basis for collaborations, or just as a sounding board for people in this area to bounce ideas of each other. And so this symposium is one effort to try and correct for this deficiency. Today, on this call, we have a very broad range of people. There are people that are cash transfer program experts. They might have studied them. They might have managed them. They might have actually been on the ground running these programs. And there are some tourists. There are people like myself who haven't actually done any research in the space, but have ideas that we think might contribute. And so everybody in today's call and tomorrow's call, you have something to contribute. So hopefully, please join in the conversations. We'll have a lot of opportunity for networking, and you are absolutely welcome to share ideas and your opinions. Now, before we start, just a few quick logistical notes. Today's and tomorrow's talks and panel sessions, all of the prepared stuff, will be recorded and shared after the symposium. We will obviously not record any Q&A sessions or any networking sessions, but all of the prepared remarks will be recorded and shared. The chat function is going to be our primary area for you to share ideas, links, questions, any information with other participants. We, the organizing team, will also be sharing some helpful information in that chat window. So for example, you will see soon a link to the entire symposium schedule. You will also see a link to all of the speaker bios. So that way we're not going to go into in-depth introductions about any one of our speakers. As well, you will see a bunch of Zoom guidelines for those of you who are attending, just to help you get the most of your experience on this symposium. Please post any questions you have for the speakers in the chat window as well. If there is time, the host of each particular session will either ask your question or perhaps call on you to ask your question. And if your question is unanswered, we will be sure to collate all questions and try and get them answered for you post symposium. A couple of other quick things. We will also greatly appreciate if everybody keeps their microphones off, unless you're speaking, but cameras are welcome if at all possible. Please stay as long as you can. In fact, in particular for the networking sessions, because of course that is one of the central goals of the symposium. And for the speakers and panelists, as requested, you will hear a warning bell when you have about 5 or 6 minutes left in your session, depending on what we have discussed with you. That warning bell is going to sound something like that. That's also my cue to welcome Shugato Datta to get us started with today's events.
Good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you are, and thank you, Dilip, for your remarks. The application of behavioral insights to cash transfer programs, we think, has enormous promise to make something that's already a powerful, multifaceted tool of poverty alleviation even more effective. So this promises to be a great couple of days as we talk about some of these issues. And we couldn't have asked for a better way to get things going than to hear from Dean Carlin, our keynote speaker for today, whom I'm delighted to introduce, although he probably needs no introduction for most people interested in empirical development economics. Dean is the Frederick S. N. Nevers Distinguished Professor of Economics and Finance at Northwestern University. Together with Chris Udry, he co-directs the Global Poverty Research Lab at that university. He's also the founder and president of Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA, a nonprofit organization that probably many of you have either interacted with, worked for at some point, or read research from. And he's on the executive committee of the board of directors of JPAL. I won't go more into Dean's very impressive biography and all the interesting work that he's done, except to just say that he uses experimental methods and behavioral economics insights to examine what works and what does not work in addressing social problems and why that might be the case. And he's worked extensively on the area of various kinds of anti-poverty programs and the financial behaviors of low-income households in the developing world. So, as I said before, he's a fantastic and very apt person to kick us off on our 2 days of discussing these topics. I'll hand over to Dean now, and we'll return to moderate the Q&A session after his talk. Just to repeat what Dilip said, please do enter your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Over to you, Dean.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's great to kind of be here with everybody. It's hard to imagine a year after COVID started, we would be doing conferences and gatherings on this Zoom thing. So this is my first time on Zoom, so forgive me if I do any technical issues. You can't do jokes over Zoom, I guess. You just can't do it. It just doesn't work. Let me do a screen share. Hold on. Great. So the way you set this up, I think is actually spot on, and I was really excited to see you doing this, and thanks for organizing, and thanks for everybody coming. Our space is strikingly small in the sense our researcher and development and evidence community, in the sense that we share a ton, but we tend not to have focused gatherings, and we also don't share enough, in my opinion, on methods issues that are related to kind of common questions. And one of the punchlines I'll get to at the end that I'll just talk a little bit about is an angst that we kind of have too much expectation of any one paper, and the lessons that we're all going to learn collectively here are going to come from seeing more commonality in the way things are analyzed and measured and data and things of this nature. So I really appreciate the effort to contribute to that cause with this gathering. So thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open up with some kind of broad thoughts, and then I'm going to jump into some specific papers. Oops, I need to look at the camera, not you guys. I can move you guys over here. Okay, so escaping the catch-22. What do I mean by this? Basically, think about the following as a little bit of like a catch-22 for cash transfers. It's not a really deep one. I don't mean this in a critical way. In fact, if anything, it's just a way of motivating some of the ways that we do see cash-22s done. So what is, obviously there's a goal with cash transfers that is just mere redistribution, and I'm not touching that. There's also a goal of cash transfers that says, look, there's problems in the world, and so some cash to the people who are suffering those problems can help in ways that are just over and beyond redistribution. So what do we mean by when we say over and beyond redistribution? We're talking about a market failure. We're talking about the fact that there's something going on where they're not able to where the market has just not worked perfectly well to help them help this problem go away. And then the cash transfer is under the premise that people know their needs the most, they know the problems they face, And so let them have the money so that they can address their problem the best. And so let people optimize is the basic premise, right? But then the catch-22 is, well, how are they supposed to optimize? Oops, missing a quote there. Let people optimize needs markets to work, right? So, if the problem they're facing in a very simple way would be something like, suppose it's nutritional information, and that's the source of the nutritional problem that is the symptom that we observe. We observe child malnutrition, we observe things like that. And then let's say with some of the most amazing research and diagnostics, you're able to say, okay, great, the problem is information. The household doesn't, is working off kind of some old information that has been passed down from generation to generation. Some of it has wisdom to it, but some of it does not. Some of it does not have the latest in what we know about what nutritional content and needs of children to grow. Handing that household $10 does not allow them to just immediately go to the information market and buy that information. And so, this idea that you're transferring cash because markets don't work to help people solve problems is kind of almost a little bit weird in a very simplistic view of it, because it's like, well, if markets don't work, then what are they supposed to do with the cash? Where do they go to buy the information or whatever the problem is? Now, there's several ways out of this catch-22. I'm not posing this. I want to be really clear. This is a whole gathering on cash transfers, and I'm not posing this as some way of saying like I think it's a bad idea. But I find it to be a useful guiding force for thinking about what to measure and thinking about how to design cash transfer programs and whether to do cash transfer programs bundled with other things. So here's like some ways out of this catch-22 that I find helpful to think through. One is there could be behavioral constraints. I know that's near and dear to a lot of people on this call, including myself historically, and I say that both by introspection, looking at my own personal challenges, but also preponderance of evidence of different kinds of biases guiding us away from the things that we would say we want in a moment of full reflection and deep reflection and full information. And so, that's hence the whole sprouting of the world of nudges. So those could be situations in which the market is working, so to speak, from a business perspective. But that doesn't mean you have individuals always embracing and buying the services that is the service that they would want to buy in that moment. And a good example of that might be things like long-term preventative health. Where the market might be there, they can buy they can go and get the immunizations, but they're not completing the immunization sequence. Household bargaining, I'm going to skip over, but I just want to note that it is a complicated and important factor to consider here. That when we think about market failures, we might be thinking about market failures within the household. We all know that the unitary model of the household is this kind of absurd simplification that we all, or at least I have, and I suspect many of us, if not all of us, have made a zillion times when doing our own work or evaluating and refereeing and considering other people's work, because it's not the research question being asked, and so we just treat it like household income and household consumption. But of course, it's kind of silly, and we all know that. I've never seen a single paper which supported the idea of a unitary model of the household. So that complicates things in the sense of having to understand whether a cash transfer is, how is it actually being delivered? And you could think about in-kind services, goods and services, as actually addressing those issues or worsening them. So that's why I just can put that into the complicated category and point out that does create some challenges. The third is through targeting and customization. So this is kind of like saying first best is impractical. So let's take my one example I've always used is the nutritional information as a situation where first best just might not be practical. So you do some amazing diagnostics, you understand the root cause of the problem, you say, okay, it's information, great, let's go do first best, let's go provide information. And then someone says, really? How's that going to work exactly? Who's going to do the teaching? Are they going to believe you? Are they going to understand you? What pedagogical approach are you going to take that makes you think that you can just take this nutritional information and go and distribute it, and all of a sudden everybody starts shifting behavior towards your prescribed nutritional content that you want everybody to take. And obviously, assuming that everybody here, this does remind me of one of the most infuriating family conversations I've ever had over Thanksgiving, where I had a relative who told me that if any student doesn't get a perfect grade on my class, that is my failure. And obviously as a professor, I was like, well, I get you that I have some responsibility to teach, but like I really don't think I get full I don't think that's a metric of my success, is their grade. Yeah, it was a frustrating conversation. Great guy, love him dearly, but that was a frustrating conversation. So how this is not an easy, that may not be practical. It might not be practical to do the first best. It also might not be practical to just know who those people are. What are you going to do? Go run a test of nutritional information in communities to see who knows, who doesn't, and then go target as such. So just knowing who needs what and then knowing how to deliver that might actually be like this ideal view of like, oh, wouldn't this be great if this is how the world could work, and we just have diagnostics and we know the problem and then we go provide it. And that's just not realistic. And maybe the second best is best, which is hand them cash and they'll buy more food. Or in that case, you maybe could argue in kind might be better too in goods, but not services, by providing nutritional supplements. But let's not go down that path. It's just there's a very practical implication, and this is the thrust of the studies I'm about to share with you, which is to say, it almost feels like a cop-out what I'm about to say, but I don't mean it this way. You say, well, maybe it's a little of both. Maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle. No, I do think it's probably true that most deep debates in the world are empirically, the answer empirically is about somewhere in the middle. But I think there's a lot of merit in this particular situation with cash transfers, where there's a lot of things where markets are working and people can optimize, and giving them that autonomy and that respect makes a huge amount of sense. But that there are some things which are not market, you can't just transfer $10 and expect there to be a market for people to buy certain services. And so thinking through what that kind of cash plus model makes a lot of sense. And that's now what I'm about to kind of mostly launch into as soon as I finish kind of some opening thoughts. The second theme of opening thoughts has to do with measurement. I struggled with these photos to decide whether these were right to capture the essence of what I want to say here. I'll let people tell me afterwards if it worked or not. So I think of measurement, first of all, measurement as a goal is obviously not just evaluative, but also to help us understand which problems are being solved and why, and so that we can think about the context and the targeting and the design of cash transfer programs. And the basic problem is, I think of, when you think about a cash transfer as, basically like, and you have to sit there at the very beginning of a study of a cash transfer and someone says, great, what are you going to measure? And it's kind of like taking a bottle of water and pouring it on a table and having someone say to you up front, tell me exactly where the water is going to go. You're like, I don't know. Like, it's a table, it's flat. I mean, I don't see any grooves, so I just don't know. I have no idea where it's going to go. It doesn't seem to be at an angle, but I know the water is going to go somewhere. It's going to go somewhere, right? But I have no idea. It's a flat table with no grooves. And so, how do you measure that? Where do you, that's not easy. You go all over and you just kind of see where the water goes. Statistically speaking, that's a problem. That's like, how do you correct for multiple hypotheses? You need massive sample sizes. You could see the money split up in 10 different directions, and you don't have statistical power for 1/10 of your sample to measure each of these individual things, but yet each of those stories is actually true. It's the right story. And so then you look at your data afterwards and you say, looks like the cash transfers didn't work. And the answer is that it actually worked amazingly, but with 10 different paths. And so when you went under each of those little spots, in those 10 spots, you had 1/10 the data of your treatment group kind of moving in that direction. And it looks like, this didn't work. And in fact, it's the opposite of working. What happened is that you empowered people to choose how to spend their money, right? And they chose all sorts of different paths. So that should be frustrating to someone who's like an advocate for cash transfers, right? The alternative is my little graph on the right, or is that left? the in-kind goods and services, where, you're transferring a bed net and you go and you see, is the bed net being used? You know exactly where to go. That's the top of the slide, is you get to see that, and you get to, go down the middle and you see less malaria, and you get to go to the end where you know exactly what that's supposed to do, which is, reduce child mortality. There you go. It's nutritional supplements, and you stay at the top and you measure at the top and you see, okay, great. The first thing that should happen is they're eating the nutritional supplements. The second thing that should happen is they should grow more. The third thing that should happen is that they grow enough, stunting goes down. And the last thing is that, they're now, cognition goes up, school performance goes up, et cetera. All right, so that may be a little more spread out, but, big open pool at the end. So, that makes things easier, right? This is also a real problem for the comparison thing that we've all seen happen, and I've done it and others have done it, where we say, okay, well, let's just compare this to cash. It's always a little bit kind of weird. I've always been kind of scratched my head at that and saying, well, I don't understand what the metric of success is here. If you're, it's kind of like having a horse race where one of the horses is playing checkers and the other is running the track, and you're like, well, I don't understand why should we be competing? They're playing checkers and I'm running a racetrack. So if you have totally different objectives in what you're doing, what do you compare? You take one tiny little outcome, child stunting. Sure, you can do that, but what if they optimize and just to be clear, if cash beats nutritional supplements and child stunting, then you have an easy case to make, right? You say, great, we won cash. But if it doesn't, you didn't lose, right? The money was spent on some other things that may have been even more pressing. Who knows? Okay. So this, whoops, whoa, sorry. The elusive, I just got to stop using my mouse. The elusive, ultimately this is about asking those, the elusive why question that we spend so much time talking about when we do evaluations, and research in general. We don't want to know just, it's helpful to say, did it work? But of course we all always want to know why, right? And this is, couldn't be more true with cash transfers. The problem as researchers for cash transfers is the why is like all over the place, right? You could tell many stories as to why a cash transfer may lead to a change in someone's life. In general, I find it helpful to think about 4 categories of ways that we tackle the empirical question of why, and I'm being clear by adding the word empirical. There's obviously theory to go alongside the empirical so that they can map to each other and you have some nice quote theory of what you're doing. So the first is through data. Think about 3 types of data that are very helpful for getting at the why. There's qualitative data that can be helpful to form hypotheses, interpret results. And then there's short run and long run. One of the things I'm always most struck by, and this is really applicable to cash transfers, is when back in 5 years ago, we had, at that point in time, we had 6 randomized control trials in microcredit. We had published, Jonathan Zinnemann and I had published one in Science in 2011. And then there was a special issue of the American Economic Journal, which pushed out 6 simultaneous randomized control trials in microcredit that did it in a way that allowed a lot of comparison, which was very nice, and actually led to the paper I'll refer to in bullet 4 there by Rachel Meager. This is a really great paper, or set of papers. And the striking thing about those is, we found mostly null results on average income and average consumption. A few signs of some good things happening, very few signs of bad things happening, and so that was actually considered a win for most of the for-profit advocates of microcredit. But a lot of the sector was actually fairly unhappy with the results, and they kept pushing, saying, "Oh, but it's all about long run, and you need to get more long run data." And the thing that struck me about that is I thought the biggest flaw in those studies was that we didn't have enough short run data. And I say this, very much about my own studies, as just the others as well. None of us did, because nobody was really able to speak to what people did with the money. Like, okay, so you got a loan. What's the first? Where did it go? And like, you need that to get at the why. Like, why is microcredit working or not working? Well, the first thing you need to know is, what are people perceiving as the thing that they are, most in need of, that the capital constraint is preventing them from being able to do. And no one really had an answer to that, because the first measurements usually started about a year later. And the same, I think, is true of cash transfers, that I think a lot of times the studies were all, of course, we all care so deeply about long run that we kind of have this constant push for long run. We need that too, I'm not saying in lieu of, but we also would really benefit a lot from, 1 month data. Ideally, that also then is just, sat on. I guarantee you, if you write a paper with 1 month data, I almost guarantee you referees will be like, where's the 1 year? So, I suspect that the right answer is to just have the short run data combined with long run. I can tell you for a fact, we have actually a short run paper on microcredit called Follow the Money, which we're very excited about, and we did not get, and we tried publishing in top journals and did not succeed because of issues of that nature, where we did actually get the short run data on microcredit. Second path is to randomize treatment arms. Often is useful for getting at the elusive why. Obviously, that's kind of a long run strategy, and not always possible depending on the context. And then the third and fourth are about heterogeneity. A lot of the whys implicitly are stories about heterogeneity that are telling us, well, if we understand more about why something works, we have some prediction about it working better for some people versus others. That's 3, and 4 would be about program sites. So the study that I'm about to share with you now is a paper we published in Science, and then I'll very briefly about that, and then I'll tell you about new work coming after that. And this is where an agenda that's like Rachel Meagher's at London School of Economics, I really admire, where she is doing a tremendous amount of work to pool together multi-sites and use Bayesian methods to figure out how to aggregate. And it gets, when we publish this Science paper, a lot of times when I presented, people would say, well, what's the, why did it work so well in Pakistan and Ethiopia and India and not as well in Honduras and Peru? And my answer was always a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and I said, well, this meta rule of empirical research, thou ought not have more data points than co-authors. And so we had 9 co-authors and 6 sites. So I refused to kind of run a regression of treatment effect at the site level on various features of the program and details about implementation. But there are methods of trying to deal with this, and this is where I'm very excited by Rachel's agenda. Okay, so on to some specifics, and I need my clock. Can you remind me what my target is? I think I'm targeting 10 minutes more. Did I get it right? I think so. Or 15.
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay.
It can go maybe a couple minutes more than that.
50. Okay. Easy. Great. Okay, so now I'll jump into some new work that I'm really excited about. That is basically in this idea of bundling. And bundling here, I don't mean this in the behavioral way that often is talked about, where you kind of get someone to be more likely to do something by bundling with something else. Here I mean bundling with cash, where the idea is that the way out of that catch-22 that I opened up with is to say, look, cash transfer, there are things in which markets are working, and people do actually have, are the best deciders for themselves, and let them do that. But that's not true of everything, right? There are some areas where then some in-kind good and service on top might be the right approach. And the basic premise of this is, aside from the, kind of the way I described it with market failures, is that causes of poverty are complicated. Any singular approach usually has mixed at best results. And so if you work on many problems at once, that might actually be a key to the solution at the household level, that it's like these, one barrier constricts the next barrier. And if you just solve the capital constraint barrier by providing cash, and there's other barriers, then they don't get to optimize the way they use the cash. And so that's the basic idea of a bundled, multifaceted approach. A subtext to this kind of cash plus model that I'm about to dig into is that, well, markets work, but some do not. So if you want to dial it down to like the simplest words possible. Okay, so this is now I'm going to talk about a few different iterations of a very similar program that has a few different names that get attached to it. So where people have probably heard it called either graduation, multifaceted approach, productive inclusion. That's way too consultant jargony for my taste. Livelihood Plus or Cash Plus. I actually like the Cash Plus the most, but obviously if they're not doing cash, then it doesn't make sense. But in the current iteration, we're seeing most of these programs be Cash Plus, where there is some underlying cash to them. And often that cash is part of the government's social protection program, where they've already done the targeting, they've already identified the people who they are consider the poorest that are recipients of a cash transfer, and they're receiving some monthly cash support. In some of the cases that we've worked on, that cash support comes with a work requirement in kind of NREGA India style, where it's a cash for work program. And in other cases, it's just straight up cash support. The core of the program usually has some element of life skills coaching, although this is one of the things that I'm going to share with you, how it varies in the testing of that approach. This is trying to get at usually various behavioral issues such as aspiration, discipline, and adherence to plans, or making plans and adherence to those plans. There's usually some sort of asset transfer that's part of this. That could actually be done as cash. And in fact, the current iterations that we're seeing, those are usually done as lump sum cash transfers that are sufficient to then say buy 4 goats and things of this nature. Usually there's some technical skills training to go along with that asset transfer. This is a perfect example of where there's like a growing market in such things, but in most cases, it's really not that easy to go and take a class in beekeeping and things of this nature. If you're in Ethiopia, you'd have to go and talk with others and talk with people who have experience. And there's ways of learning those things, but fears that those learning methods don't work quite as well as and are as cost effective if in terms of the delivery system and the consistency of what you learn. And so that's often part of these programs. And then there's usually some aspect of trying to promote savings with access to formal sector accounts. That's for obvious reasons shifting a lot these days to mobile money as a vehicle for promotion. So can it work? I'm going to share with you just one slide. The initial study we did was set in 6 different countries. For those of you who can read count, you notice there's 8 stars on here. So the paper that I'm going to show you the graph from includes the yellow stars. Bangladesh was done by other researchers. It's published in Huge Bandiara et al. Find very similar results to exactly what we're finding. So it's very exciting to just kind of see that commonality. Yemen, we actually are just finishing revisions of, and it was not part of the pooled paper because of the civil war. Everything got delayed. And it's actually a perfect example of what I referred to earlier of the downside of not having short run measurement. We have no measurement between program start and 4 years later because of the civil war. There's some things that worked and some things that didn't. So it's kind of in between in terms of the results, but obviously a very different context to roll out a program like that in the middle of a war. So here's just the punchline to show you the dark blue, the EL1 stands for end line 1, which is 2 years after the program, the assets were transferred, and EL2 is 3 years afterwards. The 2 main takeaways you should have from this are one, the results are strikingly consistent across basically all outcomes measured. And the second is that they persisted from 2 years to 3 years. There was no drop off. The program did not continue any interaction with people at 2 years to 3 years. And even had impacts all the way down to like political index, which there's nothing about the program that was trying to promote political engagement, community engagement, but did have that kind of effect. Mental health went up, physical health. Total savings going up is a little bit of an artifact of Ethiopia. Later I can answer why, but it was just a nuance that we think of the way the program was designed that it really just drove the savings component. So in the long run, we're starting to see some of the results come in. On the long run, India and Bangladesh have the longest run data, and they're in both of those cases seeing continued, if anything, increasing benefits from the program, including diversification into other income generating activities. In Ethiopia and Ghana, we're seeing more modest than India and Bangladesh, but still seeing some long run effects. An obvious question that happens when we see dissipation that's tricky and is this about catch up from the control, or is this about dissipation from the treatment group? It's a fundamentally tricky question to answer. But if we have more understanding as to why programs are working, then obviously this can help us understand more about separating those out. So I'm going to focus here onward on some new studies that are tackling 2 basic questions. One is capital a key constraint? This obviously goes right at the heart of the cash transfer. Imagine a program that did everything I just described, but without the cash transfers. And I'll show you a couple of those. And the second is our capabilities a key constraint. And here I'm using the term capabilities to capture a broad set of behavioral planning, aspirations, discipline kind of issues that are often thought to be the kinds of challenges that hold people back from making investments and investing in long run income generating activity. Okay, so are lump sum transfers asset sufficient? So in the Ghana, this is the Ghana site of the science paper. We had extra treatment arms that were not part of that original paper. The one I want to focus on here is, whoops, I moved you guys down there, is asset only. So we have, I'm not going to bore you with the others. There's a paper we can go through in detail. It's Banerjee, Carlin, Osai, Truckman, Udry, 2020 at the bottom. It's called Unpacking. And the key here is the asset only literally just transferred the productive assets. That's it. There was this full program that did all of these things together: cash transfers, transfer of goats, training, life support, life skill support. And then we had what we called the asset only arm, or we also called it the goat drop arm, where we just transferred goats. So here, just focus on the dark blue, which is the full GUP program. GUP stands for Graduating Out of Ultra Poverty. It's the name of this kind of multifaceted program, and compare that to the final column, the orange asset only. And what we see here is on consumption, we see consumption go up, kind of borderline statistically significant. We see the asset value, total assets go way up for the GUP program, and it's just 0 for assets only. These are all measurements 2 years later. So we don't have anything, I can't tell you what happened in between. And I want to be really clear, this doesn't mean transferring assets, transferring just a lump sum or even lump sum cash didn't work. It just means that the benefits didn't all materialized, you could say, in the first 2 years. And so then when we're measuring at the end of 2 years, we're measuring current consumption, we're measuring assets, we're not seeing anything remain. Income, 0, food security, 0, financial inclusion, 0, everything's flat. What we do see, which is interesting, is the goats go up. So you transfer goats, and 2 years later, they still got the goats. So the value of the goats is higher. The value of other livestock on the second column here is down. Thus, the value of all livestock is 0. So what does that tell us? Our interpretation of this is, they kept the goats, they got rid of some other things little by little, not so much that we can tell you any one thing that they got rid of. And but it says that they didn't have the ability to take on an extra income generating activity. They needed these other things to be done in order to take on the asset and use that as a way of adding income generating activity. But instead, what happened is they took the goats. Why they didn't just immediately sell the goats and treat it like cash, we'll leave that to, we could pontificate on some stories that aren't so, so complex, so difficult to believe. But that is what happened. And the bottom line is nothing new was added. So the next question to ask is, are assets necessary? So here we have a new study going on in Uganda that is of the same basic program with an NGO called ABSI. It's done in a refugee and host community context. So there's kind of 2 sites right next to each other, refugees from the Congo. And here the key you want to focus on is that we have a full program with individual coaching, full program with group coaching, but then we have this group T3 that's just individual coaching and no asset transfer. Okay, and so this is basically they do get some cash transfers. Everybody here gets cash transfers, so they have some baseline support, but the extra funding, the question is an extra asset transfer. And here assets actually, it is lump sum cash that's provided with some coaching to try to, inspire motivation about investing it in certain income generating activity, but it is just a straight cash transfer that is provided. And basically what you can see is that it's not working as well, but it's actually still generating some pretty positive returns. The productive asset value is higher, and this is with providing no assets whatsoever to transfer, other than the small kind of weekly, monthly cash transfers. Promoted livelihood activity, the actual activity being promoted goes up, food security goes way up. And so, this starts to suggest that, like, look, it's not to say that you don't get bigger treatment effects with it, But when you start looking at it this way, it obviously, the first question hopefully everybody's asking right now is, okay, well, like, tell me about the relative cost here. Maybe it's more cost effective if we do, if we don't do the asset transfer, maybe we're down here. Obviously, that assumes a lot about our welfare function as well, and like if there's certain thresholds that we want to try to get people to, and we think there's some kinks that happen once you get to those thresholds. So that's a lot loaded up into trying to do cost benefit analysis and think about how to make that trade-off. Back to the Ghana site, one of the things that we're fairly excited about is we built in this kind of side operation on top of the study I mentioned that was published in Science. In the Ghana site, we called it our bags operation. This is very similar to things that like Supreet Kaur and Emily Breza and others have done in India, where they have these kind of operations that they create where they're actually doing something, manufacturing something, making bags, hiring people to do things, and then actually studying that hiring process. And so that's basically what we did. And we made literally 115,579 of these bags. Now throughout Ghana, we've seen these bags being carried by school children all over, because we now give these out at IPA as presents to households after doing surveys. We tried selling them in like Whole Foods back in America, but that didn't work. So we ended up with all these bags, but what we were able to do is use these bags to study whether productivity changed after receiving this graduation program. Did it kind of increase capabilities of households or not? And obviously, I'm giving you a mile-high view of this. This is a full-length paper. It's kind of a lot of fun to dig in on all the various results. But basically, what we find is, for those who did the graduation program, they were able to work more on the bags. And keep in mind, the graduation program is actually like, that takes up some labor supply, right? So the fact that they're working more on bags and having the graduation program, it tells you a lot. They were able to exert more effort per hour. And we had two different types of bags, one that required a little bit more kind of dexterity and cognition and attention, because we made it a little bit more complex to make in terms of the stitching that was required. And they had a much higher capability of completing the complex bags. We found no negative income effect. So that was exciting. Obviously, one issue which I haven't touched on at all here is this, question that often gets raised with cash transfers. And as best as I can see, there's like no evidence to support this, including a paper by Banerjee and Rima Hanna and I think Ben Olkin that does a really nice job of pooling across lots of studies and finds nope, there is no negative income effect systematically. We actually find the opposite. We find not the opposite of that paper, it's consistent with that paper. We find overall labor supply increases, and so kind of a very encouraging result in terms of, from a policy perspective. It's always nicer to find that you can find that things work and that the fears don't materialize. In this particular case, we also find that this multifaceted program does increase people's capabilities to work, which is exciting. Lastly, no, it's not last, this I think second to last, is a study in Niger where we really pushed really hard on the social aspect of the program, on the life skills training and the behavioral aspects. And so here, I realize this is a little bit complicated table, but the key to focus on is that there's the full package that received everything I described, and by everything I described, let me add now this middle thing, the training on social norms and aspirations. And it was this nice video that was put together over and done over several sessions that really pushed hard on trying to help build aspirations and social norms for investing in the future, staying on track. It almost resembles a little bit like cognitive behavioral therapy. The capital package just drops out that stuff, whereas the social package has that stuff, but drops out the lump sum cash transfer. So there's no $320 lump sum given to allow immediate investment in income generating activity. And keep in mind that everybody here, including the control group, is part of the government's monthly cash transfer program. So here, this is even more consistent with what I was just saying a moment ago with the Uganda study. Here, the social, keep in mind, this is, what I really want to focus on here is the social one compared to full for the sake of this talk. There's other contexts in which I care about the capital compared to full, but right here, I want to compare the social compared to full, because the only difference is this lump sum right here. And so comparing the social here to the full, basically the same. And here on business revenue, it's not as much, but this is so much cheaper that from a cost benefit perspective, the social wins. And when you think about the consumption too, it's actually not statistically different. Food security, it's not statistically different. So this is showing that there is clearly some alternative paths other than the lump sum cash transfers to helping households generate income generating activities. Doesn't mean don't do the lump sums, right? You are seeing bigger, and like I said before, it's not obvious we should be thinking about cost benefits in a linear way in a context like this, at least when you're dealing with stark poverty. So the last one I want to share with you is another new paper. This is now different than the others in that it is not built on top of a cash transfer program, but it is just tackling this question about what people like, how much can we get out of really big relaxation of credit constraints and capital constraints. And so in this case, what we did is, I hear you, I'm good. We did big loans for small firms. This is with Garrett Bryan and Adam Osman. I'm just giving you the mile high here. We had loan sizes here. This was done with a micro lender in Egypt, where loan sizes were 4 times bigger than the last loan. The control group at loan size is 2 times bigger than the last loan. So typical microcredit studies are really studying kind of marginal changes. Like, and I don't mean this as a criticism. This is just what, this is what micro lenders do. They make small loans. So this is really going to town and saying, let's make big loans and see what happens. Bottom line is we find null average treatment effects, although we do find positive impact on consumption. It's profitable to the lender because nobody ever defaults, although they were afraid of default because of the much bigger loan sizes. But we find massive heterogeneity. The top quartile, using machine learning algorithms to kind of sift the data, the top quartile, their income is up 77%, and the bottom quartile are harmed, 52% lower profits. And so this is just the average results here. And here's the heterogeneity. Oh, sorry, I haven't. Yeah, sorry, wrong order, but I'll say this one first. So when we look at the heterogeneity, the thing that's most interesting, we think, is that it's the psychometric data that was asked at baseline that really sorts the people best. The standard data, actually, the p-value on heterogeneity on this is null. We cannot reject homogeneity using kind of standard loan application data, business size, demographics, things like this. We find arguably nothing. When we do psychometric data, which is all these questions about kind of personality and aspirations and risk tolerance and things of this nature, here's where we find big separation, where the top quartile is doing better and the bottom quartile is actually doing worse. And then we find it's true. Here's just the actual results when we kind of crisscross this with other data. So we see this is taking column 4 is taking the top quartile of treatment of predicted treatment effects on profits. This is just from estimating profits. And then we look at what happens on revenue, expenses, wage bills, total factor productivity, and household consumption for the people predicted to have the best impact on profits. And we find revenues are up, expenses are up. Some of that is mechanical. Wage bill is up, total factor productivity is up, and household consumption is higher. And when we look at the people who are predicted to be harmed, we find these things all go down as well. So, so very consistent across the data that there's kind of these winners and losers. Now, what's driving the psychometrics is interesting here. These are, this is basically now looking at what's correlated with these individual treatment effects. Higher means disagree. So people who say in life failure is not an option, people who disagree with that actually do better with the loans. I can think of several solutions to any problem. People who disagree with that do better, right? So what is this telling us? It's saying that you think about, we kind of categorize all of those into what we would call go-getters. And it tells us that go-getters are actually being harmed by getting the loan. So this is, I think of this as very consistent with scarcity theory. I'm keen to hear what others think, where scarcity theory, in a sense, says, like, look, it's like the big suitcase and the small suitcase. And when people have a small suitcase, then these people actually do better in the cross-sectional, by the way. If we just look at the cross-sectional at baseline or the cross-sectional within the control group, the go-getters, people who agree with these statements, have higher profits, have higher total factor productivity. But when we then unleash a massive loan on them, then they do worse than the others. And so it's these people who are the go-getters, but then when you completely unconstrain them on money, then they become impetuous and they make bad decisions. And so the constraint of capital, the capital constraint actually kind of the environment in which they prosper the most. So that's the basic implication. So wrapping up, yeah, kind of what's my punchline on all this? Look, nothing is a panacea. No one paper, no one project is going to answer our questions about what we need to do. There is a very clear trade-off we're facing in this space between costly customization and cheap standardized approaches. Cash obviously has this huge appeal of being able to be transferred at minimal cost. I mean, just look at Give Directly's cost structure. It's titillating. It's just amazing to be able to get that kind of cash to low-income households with like so few barriers and leakage along the way. I mean, that's just an exhilarating presence in the world. Of course, there's no customization there, right? So how do you get that trade-off? I do think the cash plus model holds promise. We're seeing huge success, and we're seeing success in the long run. So that whereas we know that immediate cash transfers might address some immediate humanitarian needs, I mean, we know that they don't do as well as we would love them to do for long run issues of poverty. And behavioral constraints are real, and they can really be relaxed. So we're learning those two things. That doesn't kind of doesn't tell us immediately exactly what to do in every place, because obviously the whole point of behavioral constraints, one of the whole points, is that they're quite heterogeneous. So the angst for our space as researchers, and I swear I'm done, is that, look, we need more replication, and subtext is we expect too much of any one study. We need more replication. We need more comparable high quality data. We're making a big effort at the Global Poverty Research Lab at Northwestern with Chris Udry, and Andrew Dillon leads this effort with us to really try to invest more in methods work on measurement. It's not rewarded as enough. For those not familiar with it, IPA actually has a pot of money which we raised, dole out to people who want to do methods research. Maybe you have some small add-on need that you would do something a little bit fancier in data collection to answer a methods question, but you can't afford it with the tight budget. We have a small pot of money that we can use to support such research. We think more is needed. It is not rewarded. It's a clear public goods problem. And then we also do need more work as researchers on this targeting question. How do we target with add-ons and bundles? How do we get accurate targeting? Are there self-selection processes? These are all kind of key research questions I think we need to tackle more of. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dean. We have a few minutes for questions, and actually some have come in on the chat. And my original plan was to ask the person who put it in to unmute and read the question out. But I think in the interest of time, I'll just read them out. And Dean, you can probably see them in the chat as well. But for everyone, Julian Jameson was asking, basically, in a lot of the results that you showed, some dimensions are clearly good things like consumption or health. Others are not clear, borrowing, working more. Is there a sense that simply increasing all kinds of activities positive in general, at least for this group, or is there another rationale to believe that those specific things should be encouraged here?
Thanks, Julian. It's funny. I feel like Julian is like this little voice in the back of my head. I must have heard you as I was presenting that very slide, which doesn't totally surprise me. I've actually known Julian from before I was a PhD student. So we go way back. So I heard you as I was presenting, and I almost said, I really ought to take borrowing out of that slide. It doesn't belong there. It's just been one of those things that's just stuck there. It is interesting to observe that it happens or not, but I completely agree more that it's not a more is better kind of thing. Working more, that one I might actually like to, I think that one we should probably keep, because it's not, as long as it's said in the right context, that it's not being said in a way that says, oh, we think poor people are lazy, and so this made them less lazy. As long as it's not said in that context or interpreted in that context, the fact is there's a lot, we all know there's labor market failures. And so to the extent, and a lot of lack of labor supply is about there being zero return to providing labor. And so if you are able to see that people are working more, it is almost undoubtedly in this kind of context, as I see it, a consequence of learning that there was a good profitable return to labor that was being provided and offered that someone was able to see. So that one I'm happy with and I like. I don't think we've hit that point in the labor leisure trade-off where we should start saying more leisure is good at this point.
Great, thanks. Jiang, do you want to ask your question or by unmuting?
Yeah, but I think my question is sort of answered in the last so in the last experiment that didn't give us. So my original question was, could you talk more about the heterogeneous treatment effect for those cash transfer programs? Because I think by understanding the correlated characteristics of the household might help us understand the why behind it and help us target.
I couldn't agree more with the second thing you said, but I would very much caution that you should not be satisfied by the last table I sent as satisfying the answer to your question.
Right. That's right.
There's no way. Like, it's just one paper, it's one loan. It's, in Egypt, there's all sorts of contextual factors. There's just, you should never, that is a question we should need to be asking a ton about. And we're going to triangulate as well. The fundamental problem we have with heterogeneous treatment effects empirically is that inevitably, at least in my experience, they're always underpowered research questions, and so they become an unfortunately luxurious research question, and it's hard to know up front what dimension of heterogeneity is going to happen. We are seeing some amazing new tools from machine learning that are allowing us to do analysis that we previously hadn't been doing, but they also make it very hard to get inside the box to understand what's actually driving the heterogeneity. You kind of left with this, like, there's some magic that happened inside a box, and then you do a bunch of univariate comparisons to try to kind of figure out sort of what maybe is going on. Hopefully that world will improve a lot. I'm not, and I'm saying that as criticism, I'm saying that as a, that space is well aware of those challenges. I do think the approach that Rachel Meager is taking is very fruitful, has some really exciting work that came out of the microcredit collection of 7 studies there. We are working with her on the doing that same analysis with our data from science. And there are some patterns there of the program working differentially across mental health, but not nothing that's out yet that I was able to share. So.
Thanks, Dean. One more question that I think is quite interesting is, how do we determine what in-kind goods or services to provide in the Cash Plus models? You talked quite a bit about the promise of Cash Plus, and especially given that some of these are kind of multi-site, multi-country, and what outcomes to measure, moving across context, how do you make a determination of what should really be in there in this Cash Plus model?
Yeah, this is the argument against it, in a sense. It's like, I can describe a process that our partners go through, and it does require, there's a lot of local engagement to help understand what the local problems are that they are identifying. And so some of it is theory based in that way. Some of it is practical based, where it's like, no. Once you have the trains, you got the tracks, you got a train going with 4 cars, and you can add on little choo-choos. And so you end up with like a lot of things just kind of being added on. It's because we can. Like, so why did you do bed nets? As well, because malaria was an issue, and we had the train, so we just added on a bed net choo-choo, and off it goes. And so some of that is done just because things can be added on and so easily. Like deworming pills is a common thing that got thrown into this, because you're having a meeting, you have the mothers there, you see the kid with the distended belly, and then the person says, hey, they need deworming pills. So it's not a mass deworming program like we've seen policy shift, but you're able to tack on these things in a very cheap way. I realize that's not a very satisfying answer, but there is this kind of process that we've seen happen in these models where the local parties are engaged, understanding the issues that they're trying to solve, trying to learn from outside world and outside evidence about what add-on components have maybe been successful at some level on their own and then added it in. But some of it is undoubtedly adding in things that don't work. And then making it harder. And I have this fear with some of these programs that they're trying to do too many things. And we all know the classic issue with, you try to do 10 things and you end up doing nothing well. And so this is, I realize I'm not giving you a very satisfactory answer, like there's some formula to it, but this is in some sense the biggest challenge with figuring that out. And that's one of the arguments for cash transfers. when you can figure it out.
Well, thank you. I mean, I actually don't think that's I mean, I think that is the realistic answer in the sense that you are driven by these constraints about what you know stuff about and what the possibilities are. The idea that there's sort of a global, optimum that we'll be able to get to is probably not, where we're heading. So I think this was great. Thank you. I think we've covered all the questions and we're right at time. So thanks again, Dean. Thank you everyone for participating, and we will now continue.
We're going to continue with our program, and in the spirit of getting to know key players in this space, I want to introduce our next speaker. The important thing that you need when you have a cash transfer program is to actually make payments. And one of the biggest players in that space is MasterCard. And MasterCard has a foundation that goes with it. It's called the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Ali Schmidt-Fellner is the manager of knowledge and insights at the foundation. And one of her roles is to manage partnerships with think tanks, with academics, with multiple projects. And so who better to tell us a little bit about what the foundation does and how everybody on this group might be able to either contribute to the foundation's work or get help from them. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ali. As always, any questions for Ali, please leave them in the chat and we will handle them as and when we have time.
Thank you, Dilip. I really appreciate it. Can you all hear me and can you see my screen? Great. Are you seeing a screen with notes or a screen without notes?
We have no idea what you're going to say, so I think we're on the right screen.
Okay, great. Those are just for me, but there's a lot to cover, so I want to make sure have everything working. But thank you for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. Thank you to the BEAR team for the invitation to the symposium. I have already learned so much from panelists and from Professor Carlin and the breakout sessions and what everyone's doing. My name, as you mentioned, Dilip, is Ali Schmidt-Fellner, and I work at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is the social impact hub of MasterCard. And I've been invited to share a bit about MasterCard and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth's engagement with respect to cash transfers, as well as wider financial inclusion, the field of wider financial inclusion. So with that, I'll jump to the next slide. So it goes without saying that the events of this year, and we've heard from other panelists today, have really been a wake-up call to the widening economic, social, and digital inequities our world is facing. And there is continued need for relief in the wake of COVID-19. In fact, in 2020, MasterCard launched over 250 government disbursement programs in over 50 countries, and more than half directly for COVID relief. We've also seen increased momentum on guaranteed income programs. We've partnered on several actually already in the past year in the US. And we've even received requests to develop citizen-to-citizen relief platforms. So for example, with the city of Los Angeles, we've worked with the Angelino campaign to support a platform to get relief to unbanked and undocumented residents who were not otherwise eligible for relief. And so, as a global payments technology company, MasterCard believes it has
for sure
an important role to play. Sorry, someone unmuted? Or were they talking?
Go ahead, Ali. I think someone was unmuted, but we'll make sure that they're not.
Okay, thanks. So as I was saying, as a global payments technology company, MasterCard believes it has an important role to play in responding to the crisis. And as some of you know, we've been investing in financial inclusion programs for over a decade. In 2015, MasterCard has helped 500 million people connect to the global financial system. But in April of 2020, given everything going on with the crisis, we actually doubled down on our commitment and pledged to bring another 500 million people into the digital economy by 2025. And that will take place through a variety of channels, ranging from government disbursements to microfinance institutes, and digitizing payroll for informal workers, just to name a few. But switching gears from MasterCard's wider role on financial inclusion and cash transfers to my job at the Center for Inclusive Growth, we take MasterCard's core competencies as a technology company that has a deep understanding of how to use digital networks to increase access to important services like payroll, benefits, and microloans. And we align those core competencies with activities happening across academia, with NGOs and other sectors. And we engage in partnerships to maximize social impact. Since our inception, at the center's inception 7 years ago, we continue to commit to building inclusive and sustainable economies around the world, economies where everyone benefits from growth and where everyone stays resilient in the face of an economic shock, and no one group bears the brunt of the recession. So to achieve this mission, we have built out a social impact portfolio at the center, backed by a $500 million impact fund. And we're really most interested in programs and research at the intersection of technology, data, and inclusive economic development. And of course, behavioral science and cash transfers are critical avenues for the pursuit of that. It's also important to note that we focus on research that can inform practice for financial service providers, digital financial services, and NGOs. So just to give you a couple examples of some of the projects we're really excited about that we think are relevant to this group, we're currently launching a project around building financial resilience for digital gig workers in Latin America, who typically don't have the same benefits infrastructure of a traditional employee. And through digital nudges, we're encouraging uptake of savings and insurance projects, and that's in partnership with Common Sense Lab. Many of you may know them. Another example that we're excited about is helping garment factory workers in Bangladesh and India get paid more safely and reliably by digitizing payroll systems. It's an industry that's primarily women employed, and cash payments are often collected by the men of the family. And we found that digital accounts actually enable, go to a woman's account, enable women to maintain more control over their finances. So we're excited about that, happy to share more. And this slide really just switches the projects I showed to all of the fantastic partners we work with. You can see a range of academia, NGOs, mayor's offices, national governments. We have a fantastic longstanding partnership with the Reach Alliance at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar, where student researchers develop case studies on innovation programs serving last mile populations. I actually think you're going to be hearing from them later in the conference. Really excited about that. They have some really new, interesting work. And Give Directly is also a winner of our data.org challenge, which is around advancing data science for social impact. And I actually believe Professor Carlin is involved with the study we awarded recently, and it's on mobile phone and satellite data used to target emergency cash transfers in Togo. And I think there are going to be some findings coming out in the next few months as that unfolds. So lastly, I just wanted to offer a deeper dive into one of our more mature programs, where we're starting to learn and see some early results in a project in Kenya. In Kenya, 70% of national retail sales happen through small informal shops called dukas. And one of the greatest challenges for these shopkeepers is they operate in cash and paper operations. And as a result, they don't have to access credit through formal banking channels that could help them to buy more merchandise and grow. And they can end up stuck and not able to grow. And so to address this issue, MasterCard has partnered with Unilever and a bank in Kenya to pilot a program called Jazaduka, which means fill up your store in Swahili. And it essentially provides virtual accounts to provide supply chain financing, and you can pay back loans to build a credit history, sort of a proxy for credit history. And so far, 20,000 shopkeepers have signed up for this program. As the program's been underway, we've partnered with UC Berkeley and an NGO called Arifu to study a couple of things that we think are perhaps of interest to this group. One, we really want business training to be a critical component of this program. And we need to find the most effective digital messaging and nudges that leads to engagement in the program. So we're studying that. And two, once they're in the program for business training, is it effective and does it help with business efficiencies? And so, I just wanted to share some quick interim results. They're in a works in progress, but thought it would be interesting. So with respect to the digital nudges, we tried a lot of different messages, a lot of different, digital platforms. But the highest adoption we found uses social norm framing, i.e. find out, how others are using loans to grow. And it also has a component of a small incentive, like a $1 phone credit that's easy to access. So we're honing that messaging to get them to the training. And then we have found, interestingly, that those who do participate in the training actually report more daily revenue and more daily profit compared to the control group. So we're looking into that a little further. And interestingly, we don't see that the same levels of success with women shopkeepers. So we're trying to unpack that a little bit and understand what the difference is and whether we should be thinking about a different training mechanism. So all that to say, watch this space as we finalize the findings. As with many programs around the world, COVID has affected some aspects of our evaluation, but there has been a silver lining, which is because these digital accounts were set up before COVID, we've actually been able to provide COVID relief to these shopkeepers that they would not have otherwise had. And we've also been able to send them important communication on public health throughout the course of this year. So now we're studying some impactful digital nudges for them to act on relief and health messages, and lots to come, I'll just say. So just lastly, to wrap up, thank you for taking the time to hear a bit about what we're working on at MasterCard. Again, I'm so excited to hear from all of you throughout the course of the symposium on your work and insights on this critical set of topics. We welcome you to stay in touch and connect if anything in particular resonates or is of interest. We have a fantastic network of experts and practitioners across academia and NGOs, and we'd be happy to connect you with them. So with that, thank you. And I'll defer to our hosts on whether there are time for questions.
Ali, I did get a few questions. Before we get there, you did mention the Reach Alliance, and I know we will hear from Joe Wong as well as some of our projects tomorrow. Fantastic program. But I guess the questions that I got to ask you are two sets of questions, and I'll toss them out and I'll let you handle them in any sequence that you want to.
Sure.
One set of questions had to do with concrete ways in which people in this network can either work with or benefit from, or you can benefit from them. So how do you suggest, are there any programs? Like, how do people reach out to you? What are the specific things they could do to either help or get help from you? And the second question had to do with sort of from where you sit and the suite of projects you're working on. What do you think are the big research challenges in financial inclusion right now? I mean, obviously there's like, the effectiveness and let's understand if we can evaluate programs better kind of questions, but are there other big questions that are coming up?
Yes. Okay. Those are great questions. So in terms of getting in touch, I'll post my email in the chat, and I had it in the PowerPoint, but it came and went. So welcome, any conversations people have. There's a number of ways. The company has a culture of partnering and exploring partnerships. So that could happen with, I've presented, what I think is generally representative of all of the things happening across MasterCard, which is a very large company. In some cases, I'm the right person to talk to. In other cases, I know someone who would be better equipped to talk to you. So it depends on the subject, but happy to work with you on that and explore. I think the question you asked second was around, the research questions we're looking at. There's a lot. It's a loaded question. One thing I'll say personally, and not necessarily, as a representative of every perspective at MasterCard, is we do have these fantastic government disbursement programs happening. And we have the technology, the infrastructure, and the scale to support these high-level disbursements. And I think there's an opportunity to explore, an impact study in tandem with that, and really understanding, what is working well, what type of disbursement and transfer is the most effective. So I think there's something we can continue to explore. Again, I'm not the only stakeholder to decide on that, but that's one thing I think would be really interesting.
And that's interesting to me personally, as well as a few breakout conversations I had earlier, where the point that was being made is that sometimes things like design features, things like how the payment is made, can influence people's willingness to even engage in being part of a cash transfer program, right? And I wonder if there's any thought given to that, because I think often as a policymaker, you don't think about the design features, but they matter. And I wonder if there's been any conversation, any programs to try and educate policymakers almost about the fact that these little things matter because they change the way in which people engage with the programs.
Yes, I think that's a role we could help play, given our network sort of between research and policy. And that is starting to happen. For example, we do have we're supporting a guaranteed income program with the University or New York University Financial Access Initiative, and trying to help understand, what makes a strong guaranteed income program, and then the idea is for us to help disseminate that to policy. We view ourselves as sort of the intermediary to bring all those things together. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and we hope to be able to help bring research to action. That is our whole mandate.
Perfect. Thank you. We are almost at the point in time where I need to welcome our next guest. So I see no further questions, but if there are any, as always, please send them, and we will try our best to get Ali to respond to them after the symposium. Thank you, Ali. This was great. And congratulations on all of the wonderful work that you are doing.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dilip.
Okay, we will move on to our next panel. It was like 8 years ago that my colleagues Joe Wong, Janice Stein, and I put together a book called Innovating for the Global South. And in that book, we sort of asked the question about what can the Global South and the Global North learn from each other? We were obviously focused at that point in time on other forms of innovation, but that question continues to persist. I mean, there's a lot of cash transfer activity happening in the so-called Global South. There's renewed interest in cash transfers in the Global North, especially with the advent of COVID. What can we learn from each other? That's going to be the topic of our next panel. And I'm going to invite Claire Williams, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Foundation for Social Change. Claire has been involved in some really exciting work, some with Jiaying Zhao at the UBC project called the New Leaf Project. And at some point in time, if you don't know much about the New Leaf Project, we will post some links to that as well. But Claire, take us away. And we're looking forward to hearing a little bit about the Global North versus the Global South.
Thank you, Dilip, and good morning, everyone. So as you have practiced so far, we'll be moving through this panel discussion, and then if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we will get to them towards the end of today's panel discussion. So as Dilip mentioned, we are going to be talking about insights, lessons learned from cash transfer studies in the Global North and the Global South, as well as what this work looks like in a post-pandemic world. To provide some context, and Dilip said it, most of the cash transfer studies have taken place in low and middle income countries. And there's been a handful of small scale projects in the Global North and higher income countries. However, over the last 5 years, and particularly since the onset of the pandemic, there has been increasing interest in this work, both as a preventative and curative solution to poverty. And so today we have 4 amazing guests that are going to share their knowledge and expertise about what they have done in this space and what the future holds for this work. So the first person joining us today is John Gachigi. John is joining us from Kenya, where he is the director of the Directorate of Social Assistance for the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. His functions involve policy and program development, the implementation of consolidated cash transfer programs, management of payment delivery services, as well as the implementation of COVID-19 interventions through cash transfers. John is a trained facilitator on social protection and knowledge management, and he is an expert contributor at international conferences and forums. Next, we have Paul Niehaus, who is an associate professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego, where he works with governments in emerging markets to improve the implementation of social programs. He is also the co-founder and chairman of the leading international NGO Give Directly, as well as the co-founder of the emerging fintech companies Segovia and TapTapSend. Next, we have Stacia West, who is an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee's College of Social Work. She is also the co-founder and director of the Center for Guaranteed Income Research at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the co-principal investigator on the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, which is the first modern city-led guaranteed income experiment in the US. And then finally, we have Ugo Gentilini, who is the global lead for social assistance with the World Bank Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice at the World Bank. Ugo's interests encompass research and practice on social protection from high-income countries to fragile states. He has a PhD in economics and has published extensively on social assistance, including recent books such as Exploring Universal Basic Income, Adaptive Social Protection, and the 1.5 billion people question. So welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And Ugo, I'm going to start with you. So you have a bird's eye view of cash transfer projects, both north and south. And what are some of the unique differences and emerging trends that the audience should be aware of, particularly since the onset of the pandemic? And Ugo, can you speak specifically to whether they are a game changer for social protection?
Hi, Claire, and thanks for having me. Great pleasure to join this fantastic panel. Let me start with the facts, based mostly from version 14 of our global tracker. We're going to have a new version released at the end of this week with a massive update. But let me say, on one hand, there are good news. There is a steady growing number of social protection measures by governments. Over 1,400 of those measures, and 1/3 of them are cash transfers. And their generosity doubled relative to pre-COVID levels, and their coverage increased by an average of 240%. About 60% of those measures are new, and they are meant to cover people that weren't covered before, which resulted in about 15% of the world population, or 1.1 billion people, covered with cash transfers. And financing is about 800 billion, so 20% more than it was in the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. On the more sobering news, only 1/4 of cash transfers reached more than 1/3 of the population. So a number of countries really showed low coverage. About 1/3 of programs are one-off. The duration is short, about 3.3 months. Only in a few cases they have been extended, in about 10% of the cases, and spending in low-income countries is very low, or about $6 per capita. Then comes the question whether COVID is a game changer. And I think that throughout history, there have been moments in crisis and on crisis times that challenge prevailing narratives on poverty. They shake assumptions around the role of labor markets as the primary vehicle for income generation, and encourage rethinking on the goals of social protection. So some of this rethinking is visible now through the mechanics and magnitude of the response. We have the facts, but some also involves the underlying ideas and philosophy that motivate responses and then are shaped by cultural and sociological factors. And these aspects would take more time to evolve and cement, so the jury may still be out on whether we are witnessing a permanent change. So we can speak of likelihood of change happening, with some factors that will tilt the balance toward the permanent shift, and others that would rather deter it. And among the enabling factors, I would see an increasing convergence between fiscal and monetary policy, which led to 8 cases of universal cash transfers to everyone in society, and broad-based digital and delivery capabilities, including near universal identification systems, registration and payment systems, as well as the use of new technology like big data and machine learning, where information is limited. But among the deterring factors, we may also have somewhat a lingering degree of skepticism towards cash in some low and middle income countries, which is declining but still present, and which relates on how it intersects with informal provisions and particular forms of design. And there are also limited fiscal envelopes, especially in some low income countries. So a lot will depend on how social protection will be pondered against the many sectoral priorities that countries face as they emerge from the crisis.
Thank you, Ugo. And on that skepticism, Kenya's actually taken a totally different approach. And joining us is John Gachigi. And John, Kenya has one of the most sophisticated approaches to cash transfers, both north and south. Cash transfer models, and they're integrated into your national safety net and your policy framework, which one could argue provides the best opportunity to scale this approach and amplify impact. And John, I'm not sure if you're able to turn on your camera because I know we had some bandwidth issues last time, but we would love to hear from you about the programs you direct and some of the innovations that you have piloted. And I'm just going to see if John can unmute. Otherwise, we're just going to move along and then maybe John can dial in using the phone. Okay, I'm going to come back to you, John. We look forward to you joining us when your bandwidth returns. So over to you, Paul. So continuing on the perspective actually of North and South. So I feel like you bring a really unique and broad perspective because Give Directly has piloted projects both in Kenya as well as in the United States. I know you did the COVID-19 response in the US with direct cash transfer work. And so would you say that given your experience and just what you have learned from your work in both of these countries, that the perceptions around people's poverty differs between North and South? And if so, how do these differences in perceptions impact the successful expansion of this work?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So first, let me just say, good question, and I'm glad we talk about that, especially in a conversation about design, because these design questions and decisions are never sorted out in a political vacuum, right? And so for a program to be impactful, it ultimately has to be both well-designed and impactful as it's built, but also perceived as effective and perceived as legitimate in the political context in which it takes place. And so, obviously just a critical issue. My experience of this has been actually one of similarity than of difference, I'd say, in sort of working and talking across contexts. There certainly are differences. There's a long tradition of work, for example, looking at differences between the US and the Europe in terms of how people perceive, factors that affect life success and social mobility and so forth. But I think that some of the doubts around cash transfers in particular and the sort of underlying assumptions about poverty are quite widespread. You see this when you talk to people who design the programs that Ugo was describing. Talk to, for example, in my experience, when I talk to people who designed Progressa in Mexico, which was a seminal initiative, they'll talk about the reasoning behind the conditions as being both to solve a policy problem, which was that they did want to increase education, and also a political problem, which is that they didn't want the program to be perceived as a handout. They wanted it to be perceived as a partnership between government and families in poverty. And in my own experience as well, I think one of the more striking things when we started Give Directly and we were hiring people, many times people who come from the communities that we were going to be serving, so people who knew these places quite well, a lot of them were happy to have a job, but very skeptical of the approach and really didn't think it was a good idea and thought, if you give money to these people, they're going to waste it. And so it was interesting to sort of walk with them along that journey as we actually rolled things out and saw the impact and gathered the data and so forth. So I think there is something very deep and very universal in terms of this doubt about sort of unwillingness to trust other people that's true everywhere. In terms of good news, I think our experience has been very much that there is room to move those perceptions with data, and we're not going to move everybody all the way. And there will be times when the effects are great, right, or times when there are certain populations who may not be best suited to manage money, or for whom cash transfers aren't the most impactful thing, but in general, Give Directly started out, our first New York Times headline was, "Is it nuts to just give money to people with no strings attached?" And we've been on this decade-long journey of generating evidence and talking to people about the evidence, and I think changing a lot of minds, and that's been very rewarding. And so it gives me hope. And last, to your question about the pandemic, it's, yes, I think it's been seismic. Certainly for Give Directly, it's been a dramatic year. Give Directly last year raised over $300 million, largely for pandemic response work, both in the US and in Africa. And in my conversations with people, I think, yes, there is this clear sense of recognition that people are struggling and it's not their fault, right? It's because of something that was entirely outside of their control. I think the question is whether there's any transference of that to recognition of other factors that impact people's lives and prospects that are also outside of their control, such as where they happen to be born. And I don't know the answer to that yet, but I think that's one of the big questions in my mind as we move forward out of 2020.
Yeah, and I think that narrative is just, it's so powerful, and it's a real sticking point to advancing this work. And it's something I'd love to discuss further on in this conversation. I just want to check back in with John. John, can you hear me?
John is there.
Okay, fantastic.
Yes, I can hear you.
We're glad to have you join us. So we would just love to hear from you about the regime in Kenya, where you have integrated cash transfers into your social policy and your social safety net. And I would love to hear about some of the unique innovations that you've piloted over in Kenya.
Thank you, Claire. In Kenya, we are implementing an integrated national safety net program under the brand name Inua Jamii Cash Transfer Programs. And this comprises of 4 categorical cash transfers: one for the older persons, another one for orphans and vulnerable children, another one for persons with severe disability, and for those people who are poor and vulnerable. It's important to note that all these 4 cash transfers, they are categorical programs, and both of them are poverty targeted. And one program for the older persons is universal, aimed at cautioning the poor and the vulnerable. For the older persons, we normally target all the senior citizens who are 70 years and above without going through the other targeting. And in terms of the targeting, we have got a harmonized targeting methodology, which has got a digitalized tool, which we normally use to target our beneficiaries using the PMTs. Some of the unique innovations which we have in Kenya, there are about 5 which I mentioned. One of them is about the delivery systems, whereby we have digitalized all the payment processes for cash transfer beneficiaries, whereby all the beneficiaries, they have a bank account, and those bank accounts are linked to a mobile payment platform, whereby beneficiary can be able to access the money using the mobile fund money. And at the same time, in Kenya, we normally call it the M-Pesa. At the same time, when the money stays in the bank account, it has a saving value, whereby beneficiaries now can access the money at their convenience, and they can use that bank account for any other savings. The other innovations is called beneficiary outreach strategy. This beneficiary strategy for improved grievances and case management is whereby it's a dialogue between the beneficiaries and the implementers. And this one for us is more or less like a cash plus idea, whereby we are adding value to the cash transfer. Initially, we used to give cash. And now this time now, we have now come up now with a financial literacy program, whereby now we are empowering our beneficiaries so that they can make informed decisions when it comes to spending of their money. And if they want even to save, they can save, and then they can invest that money in any productive investment. And then number 3, we have also initiated complementary programs. Like the cash transfer now, we have got complementary programs. Because we realized that when we used to give the beneficiaries money, they used to spend that money on health-related issues, on education, and so many other things. And then they were leaving very little money for themselves. So we have come up with another innovative complementary program, for instance, like linking all our beneficiaries to the National Health Insurance Scheme, whereby all the beneficiaries will be covered by the National Health Insurance, so that if they get the money for the cash transfer, they don't use it for their health needs, but maybe they use it for food and other things. At the same time, we are also targeting the young mothers who have got children between 0 and 5 years. We have come up with a nutrition education program, whereby We want to educate them on health-related issues. At the same time, we give them like a top-up cash transfer so that they can be able to take care of the children. And finally, we also want to give our beneficiaries economic inclusion, whereby we train them on financial literacy so that they can be able to spend the money in the best way possible. At the same time, we're also giving them the solar lightings. For those beneficiaries who are not connected to the grid, we normally give them the solar lights by credit, and then after that, as a grant, but we normally give them the money and then they pay back to have that type of ownership. And finally, we have also introduced behavioral sciences and the nudges to improve the financial and economic outcome of beneficiaries. This one we are working together with the Ideas 42, whereby we have piloted in some of our counties, and some good results have already come out, whereby now we are changing the mindset of the beneficiaries. They believe that the fact that they are getting the cash transfer does not mean that they are poor. It means that we are giving them because they deserve it. At the same time, when they get that money, they can still use that money either for economic production. They can also use that money responsibly. However, we say that it's a light for them to receive the money. Even that light also comes with a responsibility. So we want to train them. We want to change their mindset. And when they are doing now the spending of the money, they make informed decision in terms of expenditure. So that's all what we are doing in terms of the innovation. But there's a lot we are doing in Kenya. Thank you, Anova.
Thank you, John. And I'm just so encouraged to see the level of sophistication and how deeply integrated that the cash transfer model is into government policy. And then that is such a sharp contrast to here in North America. And next, I want to invite Stacia to speak. You know, a lot of the cash transfer work here in the North has been led by independent researchers, social impact organizations, and advocacy groups. And there has been a real challenge working with government and integrating cash transfer approaches with existing social safety nets. And Stacia, I'd love to hear from you, particularly around like the deeply entrenched beliefs around deservedness that's embedded into our cultural policy, our cultural narrative and our social policy. And I'd love to hear some of the insights that you've gained from your work, and in particular, speaking to the intersection of these narratives with the benefits cliff, where, you know, there really isn't an interaction between cash transfers and the existing social safety net, or actually there is, but it's to the detriment of the individual.
Sure, thank you, Claire. I would actually like to speak first to the question around deservedness and, you know, will people use money unwisely? Something that all of us in this space often hear. And I think there's been a lot of good work led by Give Directly around transparency and what do people, you know, spend their money on, right? Where does the money go? And I think at least in terms of informing a broader narrative, that can be helpful and only so helpful, right? One of the things that I often say whenever I'm interviewed is that no one asks rich people how they spend their dividend checks, right? But there is, for some reason in this country, a narrative where we feel like we should be, you know, paternalistic toward people experiencing poverty. And so that is manifest in our social safety net, all the way down to the way that we feel about our neighbor who we know receives a guaranteed income. So on that note, you know, in the US, of course, we have this problem called the benefits cliff or the welfare cliff, right? And for those that are unfamiliar, that is simply that the more money you make, the fewer benefits that you're able to receive, right? Which means you're kind of always treading water. You get a raise at work, that may mean that you lose your health insurance or you're paying more for your housing. So it kind of keeps you in this steady state of sort of being a victim of the market forces and never really able to escape from it. So the trouble with implementing a guaranteed income then in the US context is that we come up against this benefits cliff. One of the best examples is Magnolia's Mother's Trust, which was a pilot led by Dr. Aisha Nyanduro in Jackson, Mississippi, where they gave women $1,000 a month to, you know, unconditional cash, spend as you please. And what happened is that the net was around $400, right? So they lost housing vouchers, they lost SNAP or food stamp benefits. So thinking about sort of return on investment, we have to think about a way that we can implement a guaranteed income in the US and do it alongside the existing social safety net, understanding that if those benefits fall away, recipients are really in no better place than they started. So some pilots are mitigating this benefits loss through local waivers, and that's essentially local relationships with the housing voucher, the housing authority, or through the local DHS office. But one of the biggest problems that we have in the US is that we cannot protect Social Security income, individuals receiving Social Security disability income. So for every dollar you receive in a guaranteed income, you then also have a reduction in your disability payment, which excludes a large part of the population here in the US. So I think looking forward in terms of advocacy, we need to move beyond state and local protections, which were fairly easy to secure so far, and think about how do we construct a narrative that makes sense for securing waivers at the federal level, right? And talking about spending data is only going to go so far with that, because once we kind of convince, I suppose, the public at large, we also have to think about the various political actors, right? And those administrators that make these decisions about waivers or integration of systems. And one of the things that I think about a lot is really the threat to the industry itself of sort of healthcare service delivery, social services service delivery, right? So if the narrative is that we're going to give guaranteed income and take away those services, right? All those folks that implement those services that I train as a social work professor no longer have jobs, right? So the importance of shifting this narrative to be a cash plus, right? We don't want to replace the existing benefit structure instead of a cash is the answer to everything is important, not only for the general public, but also thinking about the industries of social services themselves.
Thanks, Stacia. Sorry, I'm just mitigating some tech issues on my end. And I want to kind of build upon this, what really is the best way to spread and amplify this work? So in Kenya, we have the most extreme version where we have cash transfers deeply embedded into government policy. And then you're talking about this benefits cliff. We've been fortunate, at least in our work with New Leaf Project, where we worked in partnership with the local government. So they provided a waiver. So the cash that people received was actually considered a gift and not income. But for me, as a leader of our organization and wanting to expand this work and work in collaboration with everybody else that's doing this work, what is the best way for us to amplify and spread this work? Is it through government? Or is it to do it independently? And the government model in Kenya seems to be working really well. But let's say, for example, in Ontario, where the conference is being hosted, there was this amazing universal basic income pilot that was being run. It looked like it was making promising impact. And there was a new government that came into power and they prematurely canceled the project. We have also seen in the Global South that there have been some cited inefficiencies within government, actually, in India as well, in terms of actually getting payments into the hands of individuals. And then conversely, you have independent organizations that are trying to advance this work, but then we're coming up against this wall in terms of interaction with governments being inflexible and not permitting us to award these cash transfers that we demonstrate time and again through data and evidence are making a difference. So moving forward, what is the best way? Is it to go alone? Is it to embed it in government policy, so that pilot to policy approach, or is there a middle way? And I'd love to hear from any of the panelists on your thoughts about that.
Okay, so if I can start from the Kenyan perspective, that the cash transfer programs which are implemented in Kenya, most of them are government financed, and they are implemented by government institutions. For all the 1.33 million households benefiting from the cash transfer, it is 100% tax financed. We don't receive a penny from the donors or partners. The only money we receive from the donors or the partners is for capacity building and system strengthening. But when we were hit hard by the COVID, the partners, they came on board. Donors came on board, NGOs, they came on board, and they were able now to support. And from that collaboration and that partnership, we have seen that we can be able to do much. And because the government does not have the resources to reach all the poor, the vulnerable, to reach all the deserving Kenyans, the way to go is that do the partnership. But the beauty about Kenya is that already we have got a national policy on social protection. And the policy stipulates what's supposed to be done. At the same time, we have got institutions which are already set by the government. And those institutions, they have got the structures on how work can be done. At the same time, we have a database for all the poor and the vulnerable, whereby now we have got a management information system where all the data of the beneficiaries is stored. And now we are moving forward with coming up with a social registry, whereby we will have a social register of all the poor and vulnerable beneficiaries. So that moving forward in the future, if maybe the donors, the partners on the Jews, they want to come to Kenya, they don't need to go and collect data. They can use the data which will be the social registry, they mine that data, and they use that data to implement. Data which is in the partners and the donor can get in effort which they are able to do. At the same time, we have got a harmonized targeting methodology, and it is a tool which is digitalized. So even if they don't want to use the data which the government have, but they want to go and collect their own data, that tool is already. They can borrow that tool, they can domesticate so that it fit with for the beneficiary. And finally, our payment system is very good, and especially the mobile payment platform, where they can be able also to partner with us, and then they pay the beneficiaries using the mobile money platform, and the money will instantly reach the beneficiaries. Thank you.
So Ugo, Paul, or Stacia, it sounds like the Kenyan model in a way is the one to watch in terms of a government approach. What do you think? Do you think that's what we should be looking to evolve here in the North? Or do you think that it's better that we continue to advance this work independently?
Well, Claire, I was just going to say one word to the earlier prompt and to build on what John said, because when you think about the roles that different actors play, this NGO space, public sector, and so forth, the sort of NGOs pilot do risky things, government take to scale model is the one that most people think about. And so there are certainly kind of cases like that. We've done things like, for example, there's this whole sort of cottage industry now of assessing whether markets are ready for cash transfers, which I'm a bit skeptical of. And so we've done things like, let's pick the least ready place that we can find and drop a lot of money there and see what happens, and then see if it's actually informative, how ready they are. And that's sort of a thing that would be crazy for somebody spending taxpayer money to do. But the sense in which I think the logic's a bit inverted is that if you look at across the South, the global South, of the programs that Ugo and his team document, or you look at things that John is doing, for example, which are entirely taxpayer financed, these are the places that have actually been the leaders in sort of adopting this tool. And so I think a lot of our role has been to communicate to new audiences about that and about what we've learned from it, as opposed to sort of putting something new on the table. And that's a sort of an inversion of the typical logic. And so I think it's important to highlight.
So I would say I'm thrilled that philanthropists and industry is so interested in piloting these demonstrations, right? And as Paul said, like letting innovation kind of happen in the private space and then letting scale happen in the public space. I think that needs to be so careful, right? Especially as we're just getting emergent data in the US context around how to target programs, right? And where we may scale up first. But I will say we are seeing, CARES Act and associated recovery dollars now being directed specifically at cash transfer pilots in the US. So that's exciting and promising. And they're in areas where I feel comfortable that there at least is the capacity, LA being a great example of this, St. Paul, Minnesota, larger cities where they do have the capacity to scale and to do the research that we need to do.
Thanks, Stacia. So there's a question, a couple of questions.
can I chime in on this
Oh,
point?
please do, Hugo. Yeah, yeah.
So I think that, I mean, I agree with what Stacia, Paul, and John said. I think that ultimately, for having a cash transfer program or programs that are permanent, the social contract between governments and citizens, it's key. But that's a process, and in the process, there are a variety of roles that I think that the research community and civil society can play in terms of all this. Mention some of the risks that that sometimes governments are not able to take, and that others can take. Evidence building, accountability. What is sometimes a big problem is the fragmentation of approaches out there. So there is, for example, a recent paper on Yemen that shows the myriads of different interventions providing different transfers, uncoordinated. I think that something that John alluded to, that the moment, I think that even in contexts where transfers are externally financed, there are ways in which things can be done in a more coordinated way and under some sort of common framework. And I think Ethiopia is one example and Kenya is another, where all different stakeholders somewhat agree on a certain set of parameters on how to do things. That I think it's important to build step by step, national ownership over the programs. And there are cases where I think humanitarian assistance has been key for life saving, but has been largely provided outside government structures, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for less good reasons. And I think that the more, even with different actors involved, we can try to use government systems, the better. But again, there needs to be flexibility, and I think it's a long process. And it's important just to make sure that there is this common framework around which different stakeholders can provide assistance.
Thanks, Hugo. I'm looking at the chat, and there's a lot of questions actually around narrative. And I think it's a really important point to revisit, especially in the face of, stereotypes and these cultural myths. To me, where I'm sitting, I see them as one of the strongest forces of opposition to this work, particularly those narratives, as you said, Stacia, around the undeserving, but also that people are going to misspend the money. And that's one thing, but then it's not like we're simply saying or refuting these examples just through story. We actually have evidence, we actually have rigorous data, we have scientific approach. But despite having all of this evidence, the questions still persist around, the myths really around living in poverty, or people, in our case, experiencing homelessness. And so what can we do collectively to surmount this obstacle? How can we change the narrative? What do we need to do better in order to convert hearts and minds?
If I may, I'll start and say that scientists are horrible storytellers generally. And so that work really, what the way that I see it, that work is in partnership with the community, right? So in our case, it's in partnership with 25 pilots across the US to find local partners that are capable of, creating content, really, whether that be social media content, a documentary, a podcast series. And in one of our cases in New Orleans, we're working with high school students that are producing a podcast about their experience receiving a guaranteed income, right? I, as a scientist, would be horrible at that. But I think it's really relying on those local partnerships so that you're able to elevate the voices that are capable of making that change. And I think there's a million different examples of how that can be done.
Claire, it's like such a deep topic, so I'll just try to give you like the big themes I think that have stood out to me. So I think that when we're asking people to accept and believe something that's very different from what they have for a long time, it has to be, embedded in a story about why, first of all, they're not an asshole for having thought what they thought, and what they thought wasn't crazy or unreasonable. And second, the new truth that we're communicating, the new evidence, is in fact consistent with other things that they think are true about the world. And, all of that is sort of, I think, like persuasion 101 that somebody else could teach you better than I could. But, I think to kind of acknowledge the doubts and, for people whose experience of poverty is seeing somebody begging on a corner and wondering if they have a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue, to acknowledge that those are not unreasonable questions and to talk about what we know about that, how that might be similar or different to extreme poverty in a rural part of Kenya, for example. Those have been very important. I think to connect to sort of people's concern for efficiency and transparency and sort of understanding where their money goes and trying to remove as much intermediation as possible from their charitable giving, that's been important. So I think there's, it's sort of very much acknowledging people where they're at and being, receptive to that when we're trying to introduce something that's, potentially going to provoke a lot of cognitive dissonance.
And I think removing the blame is so important when you're having those hard conversations, because we see these stereotypes perpetuated in our cultural narrative, in film, in literature, in policy rooms. And so for us, it's just having the same conversation over and over again, trying to approach it with compassion and understanding and hoping that message sticks. And then what Stacia said too is really about elevating the voices of lived experience and allowing people to speak about those significant impacts that they've had in their lives as a result of this cash transfer. Ugo, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, it's probably the single deepest issue in social policy, the conflicting principles. But I would say that perhaps at the very core of the issue is this, I think, belief of or this quandary between scarcity and security. And it is, what is it that really drives people to do something? And for a long time, it has been this notion of scarcity or the threat of something being scarce. And that was believed to be a driver of putting more effort into work. And it's been a century-long debate. And I think that on the other hand, there is this notion of security that actually is a stepping stone toward actually working even more, right? But I think that still there is something around it that still generates lots of debate. And if we look at two periods in history, about in the mid 1800s and again in the 1900s, in the 1970s in the US, in both cases, there was a lot of backlash against the provision of cash transfers in both cases. And with even the built up on narratives and stereotypes. And then after a few years, there was a wave of evidence actually disproving those claims, showing that actually things worked out pretty well. So there is, I think I'm positive because now I think the timing of these debates and the one of the generation of evidence is diminishing, and we have evidence as these facts are debated. Before there was like a decade in between those, and I think the work that Paul and others are doing is also a matter of accountability. So the moment that there are, I will keep investing on that, present the facts, although sometimes facts are not enough. So there is more on how I think culture and narratives are generated, which I think sociologists and others are very good at, and that as economists, we need to incorporate more of that.
Yeah, facts are not enough. I think that's a big takeaway for me in terms of how we collectively position this work. So just looking at time, we have 2 minutes left. So I'd love for you to each keep your answers to 30 seconds. But you talk about 200 years ago. I was reflecting on 2 quotes this morning from the BC panel, expert panel on basic income. They included 2 quotes at the front end of their report. One is from Adam Smith in 1759 that talks about the need for friendship, for love, for esteem in order for a society to flourish and be happy. And then we look to the Niska Nation, which is an indigenous peoples here in British Columbia that talk about the need for our common bowl, that we need to share energy, wisdom, spirit, and joy. And then we see the pandemic, which I really think is starting to soften people's hearts and minds towards this, towards the creation of a more just and civil and vibrant society. And so let's say the year is 2031. What is the conversation we are having about cash transfers? Paul, I'm going to start with you.
Oh boy, thanks, Claire. Well, the way I guess we've always thought about this is that we have, wanted to see in the sort of global development space, so I'll kind of focus attention there because that's where we really thought and talked about it the most. We wanted to see it sort of shift to being the default, where we sort of say that, if we're thinking about doing something to help people who are experiencing extreme poverty, let's start with that. And then let's think about when there's a case that, we can do more or better by doing something different and what the evidence is for that. So organizationally, that's our philosophy, that's our goal. I think that's what we would love 2031 to look like.
Thanks, Paul. Stacia?
Sure, I agree with your statement that the pandemic has softened people's hearts, but I will not forget that they still accuse people of misusing the stimulus money and quitting their jobs. They being big they. So I think it highlights we have so much narrative change to do to get to the point where we can realize, at least I think in my mind, in the US, it is reasonable to expect a targeted guaranteed income by that time period. I don't think we would see something truly universal, but something targeted that is taxpayer funded.
Thanks, Stacia. Hugo?
It's hard to make predictions, of course, but I would say that we are on a trajectory on, I think, being more, empathy is on the rise. And I think that there is, I think, more effort in trying to be on someone else's shoes and trying to understand what it means actually being poor, but also trying to understand what are the concerns that others may hold when it comes to social policy. At the end, social policy is not just a summary of principles, it's a summary of sometimes competing principles. Every society values effort, merit, hard work, but also solidarity and compassion. And ultimately, I don't think that they are mutually exclusive. That's the whole point. And it goes back to the issue of scarcity versus security. But at the center of it needs to be empathy and the ability to understand each other and what we went through.
Well said, Ugo. And in 30 seconds, John, can you just chime in and then we'll hand it over to Sagato?
Okay, from my perspective is that the social policies we have been having on social protection, more of them have been geared toward protection. I think this is the high time now we move now from protection to production. So that now we can also enable our beneficiaries to be self-reliant so that they can do something on their own. And the partnership we want to encourage with the partners and donors, whereby we are now doing the cash plus agenda, we will gear towards now that from now protection to production. So that now beneficiaries can also start doing some income generating activities so that they can have income security.
Thank you, John. And thank you to every one of our panelists for contributing your time, your knowledge, your expertise. And over to you, Sagato.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you all of you for that really interesting discussion. And also thanks for everyone. I'm amazed that we have somehow managed to have an entire few hours and we've entirely stuck to time. This is not an achievement that should be discounted. So all the people working behind the scenes, it's been really fantastic. So just wanted to briefly sum up some thoughts that I had from the discussion and the presentations today. I think Dean set the stage for this conference really well with a really fantastic tour of what we've been learning and some of the important unanswered questions in the field of cash transfers and allied programs. One key thing that stood out to me was the need to further unpack the components that make a program as impactful as possible in any given context and do that in as cost-effective way as possible. And so we have to keep exploring ways in which we can figure out what components of programs really need to be there for them to work well, how we can deliver them most cost-effectively, and how can we relax some of these psychological constraints and decision-making that might be reducing the impact of some of these programs. And it was fascinating, of course, to hear about the work that Dean and others have been doing to answer these questions within the context of the AltaPro graduation programs. Plenty of food for thought, I think, and plenty of scope for further research and piloting, which I'm sure people already probably have ideas about. We then heard from Ali Schmidt-Fellner at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth on I think a very wide variety of fascinating and ambitious programs to bridge digital divides, use behavioral nudges to get people to engage with digital financial services and so on. I personally was very enthused by the range and the ambition of the work that she described, and I'm sure others were too. I hope many more collaborations will emerge from today's interaction. And I won't try to sum up the wide range of things that our panelists on the last panel, ably moderated by Claire, covered, but I think Hugo's intervention gave us a really good sense of the wide scope of what's going on globally in social protection and cash, and how it's responded to the pandemic and how important this has been. And then Paul Niehaus, Paul Gashigi, and Stacia West all took us into specific contexts and helped us to really see the goals and challenges and the approaches that were being taken to address them in different settings. So I think we've begun to see the many flavors that these programs come in, how they've been used, and how they're being expanded, how they're responding to the crisis, and what the political economy as well as delivery challenges are and how they can be met. I think it was particularly interesting, to me at least, to see the issues around the way in which recipients spend or are assumed or perceived to spend the money they receive, and the broader and sort of political and social support for transfer programs emerge in comments from people working both in the global north and the global south. And I found Hugo's comments about the scarcity versus security framework really useful as a way of thinking about how to get these programs to scale and how to get the narrative right about what they are. And given that we really need to understand and I think, the work that behavioral scientists such as, Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir and others have been doing to help us really see that scarcity does not necessarily act as a motivator, and it really acts much more as a brake on certain kinds of actions, and frame our work in cash around that. So all of this to say, I think it's been a fascinating first day. I think we all look forward to much more collaboration in this space. And as Paul noted, a lot more sort of south to north learning, given where a lot of the innovations are taking place. So I think the idea of bringing people working across these different settings together was a really good one. And so hopefully all of you also had plenty of food for thought. I'm sure we'll continue to have opportunities to build on the learnings from today and to explore collaborations with others in this virtual room. And so I'll stop there and just remind everyone that we start again tomorrow at 9 Eastern time, and whatever that is in the time zones that you are in. So the same time as today, and look forward to seeing you all here tomorrow as well. Thank you very much.